Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unraveling a technological mystery that's literally decades old. And what's really cool is that it transforms this famous rumor of stolen code into a pretty profound lesson on how our human minds actually connect to silicon chips. If you've ever stopped to wonder how your wildest, most creative thoughts manage to force a piece of cold hardware to do exactly what you want it to do, well, you're absolutely in the right place.
So let's just dive right into this massive controversy that has shadowed the PC revolution since the early 1980s. For decades, there's been this really persistent rumor circulating in the tech world, the idea that the very foundation of Microsoft's empire, MS-DOS, was actually built on stolen property. It's a gripping narrative for sure, but as we'll see today, the actual truth is way more fascinating, and it tells us something absolutely essential about the architecture of trust in computing.
Section 1. The Great Software Heist.
Okay, so the initial conflict here involves two brilliant pioneers racing to control the microcomputer market right at the dawn of the 16-bit era. On one side, we had CP/M. This was created by Gary Kildall at Digital Research, and it was the absolute dominant standard for 8-bit microcomputers, the king of the hill. On the other side, you had this upstart 16-bit system called 86-DOS. This was originally and very quickly authored by a 24-year-old developer named Tim Patterson over at Seattle Computer Products. Patterson was essentially tasked with creating this substitute because the 16-bit version of CP/M was heavily delayed and hardware manufacturers were desperate. They needed an OS to test out their fancy new Intel 8086 chips. Now, the functional similarities between CP/M and 86-DOS were so striking that Gary Kildall publicly accused 86-DOS and ultimately Microsoft's MS-DOS, since they acquired Patterson's software, of blatantly copying his work. He literally called it plain and simple theft. The command structures were similar, the way it interacted with disks was similar. For years and years, Kildall maintained that the code itself just had to have been plagiarized.
Section 2. Forensic Software Detective.
Decades later, a software forensic engineer named Bob Zeidman decided he was finally going to solve this cold case. Using multidimensional software correlation algorithms and some newly discovered source code files, Zeidman set out to separate all the emotional rumors from the hard, mathematical reality. And get this, Zeidman was so absolutely certain in his forensic findings that he offered a staggering $200,000 cash reward to anyone who could prove source code theft using accepted forensic techniques. I mean, talk about putting your money where your mouth is to definitively end the speculation.
So the crucial takeaway from Zeidman's forensic findings was definitive. Absolutely zero source code was plagiarized. This completely debunked the myths of hidden copyright messages and copied internal logic. However, he did find something else that's super interesting. He discovered that exactly 22 Application Programming Interface, or API, system calls were legally and identically replicated. The function numbers and what they actually did matched CP/M perfectly.
Section 3. Replicating the API.
To really understand why Tim Patterson painstakingly replicated exactly 22 system calls without stealing a single line of the underlying code, we have to look at the massive architectural bottleneck developers were facing back in 1980. Patterson firmly denied stealing code, arguing instead that using the public CP/M manual to recreate the system interface was basically just like legally baking a cake from a published recipe. He studied the manual, saw what input CP/M expected and what output it gave, and then he just wrote entirely new 16-bit code from scratch to ensure his OS behaved the exact same way.
Why do this? Well, by mimicking the API, Patterson ensured that software developers could mechanically translate their existing 8-bit software libraries directly over to the new 16-bit 8086 platform. He even wrote a translator program to help do it. If he hadn't perfectly replicated those 22 system calls, every single developer would have had to rewrite their software entirely from scratch. So this replicated API was literally the lifeline that kept the whole software ecosystem alive during a massive hardware transition.
Section 4. Crossing the Semiotic Bridge.
And this brings us to a really brilliant philosophical pivot for our explainer. You see, Patterson wasn't just being lazy or avoiding work. He was building what computer researchers call a semiotic bridge. This semiotic bridge is literally the only reliable explicit translator capable of connecting the bounding creativity of human thought to the unbending physics of a microchip. Text isn't just for reading, guys. When it's strictly formatted into an API, it becomes the ultimate universal deterministic interface.
We desperately need this text bridge because, honestly, we are dealing with two completely alien worlds here. On one side, we have our beautifully messy human cognition. Researchers affectionately term this OS alpha. It is warm, associative, fuzzy, wildly creative. But on the exact opposite side of that physical chasm, we have the machine, the arithmetic logic unit, or ALU. It is totally cold, rigid, and strictly deterministic, operating blindly on exact clocked voltages. It has no idea what meaning is. It definitely doesn't get your jokes.
Section 5. Translating human intent.
Let's look at how this sequence actually builds from a simple thought into a physical execution inside the machine. This step-by-step workflow perfectly shows how our fluid imagination literally has to be squeezed through the rigid textual bridge of an API just to force the machine's hand. Step 1. Your intent starts as a fuzzy idea. Step 2. You formalize it into explicit text. Researchers poetically call this a divine script. In Patterson's case, this script was the perfectly replicated API of CPM. And then step 3, that script safely compiles down to command the raw hardware.
By relying on these strictly formatted text rules rather than, fuzzy approximations, we preserve a perfect, mathematically verifiable chain of title for human creativity. If we just threw vibes or probabilistic guesswork at the hardware, what the sources call relying on the FPU gambler, we'd completely lose the provenance of our data. The explicitly structured text of an API acts like a surveyor, ensuring absolute, undeniable truth right at the silicon level.
Section 6. The Legacy of the Bridge.
Returning to the origins of DOS, we can now view Tim Patterson's controversial actions through an entirely new lens of innovation. Rather than an act of plagiarism, replicating the CP/M API was a necessary, ingenious application of a semiotic bridge. It's what allowed the personal computing revolution to leap safely into the 16-bit era. Patterson didn't steal Kildell's code, he legally adopted Kildell's vocabulary so that existing human intent could continue to speak to entirely new alien hardware. And today, standardized APIs like the one Patterson utilized remain the absolute backbone of our modern digital economy, seamlessly connecting completely disparate systems all over the world.
As you go about your day today, I want you to consider the profound reality that every digital action you take, every swipe on your phone, every typed word, every single click, is really just your fuzzy, brilliant human imagination being squeezed across an unforgiving API bridge down into pure physical voltages. It's an absolute miracle of translation happening billions of times a second. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and hey, keep building.